Hi, my name's Phil Berge, and I have the privilege of serving in a consulting role with the Synod of the Trinity. I've been asked to walk you through a basic concept of the governance and leadership model that the Synod has been embracing. The purpose of this presentation is to provide you with an overview of what is contained in the materials you've been sent. Many of you viewing this presentation are fairly new commissioners, and perhaps the materials you received seem a little overwhelming and beyond what you thought you said yes to as a commissioner. As you view the rest of this presentation, and especially as you look more carefully at the materials again, please keep in mind this one overarching explanation of the model in a nutshell. When commissioners gather, they form the Synod Assembly. The Synod Assembly's primary work is visioning based on the Synod's reason for existence, something called the Synod's ends. The Synod executive and other staff, as well as related committees and groups, are charged with implementing the Synod's vision. To make all of this work well, a governing commission comprised of some of the Synod commissioners acts on behalf of all commissioners by monitoring the Synod executive to make sure the executive and staff and committees are successfully implementing the vision in alignment with the Synod's stated reason for existence. So the Synod Assembly visions, the governing commission monitors, and the Synod executive works with others to implement. Here's a diagram that shows in another way how this governance process works. You'll notice at the top of the circle that the 16-member presbyteries send representatives. John Carver, the originator of the model the Synod has adapted for its purposes, likes to consider members, in this case the presbyteries, as the owners of the Synod. So commissioners are sent and they gather together as stewards of the owner's interests. In a policy governance model, something called an ends statement addresses three things. What benefits are made possible for which beneficiaries and at what cost? Near the back of the policy manual, you'll find a fuller explanation of the Synod's ends statement, including a number of secondary ends. So the presbyteries as owners connect through the Synod Assembly, and presbyteries as beneficiaries connect through the Synod executive. The governing commission is charged with monitoring the success of all this activity. So let's take a more careful look at this policy governance model that your process is based on. Carver's model of governance is being used globally in all sectors of society, including religious and nonprofit organizations, as well as in business and government. It is a useful model for really any organization that's willing to accept its four foundations: accountability, servant leadership, clarity of group values, and empowerment. Synod staff and I have worked closely with a group of commissioners who served as a policy writing team over the past year to make sure the model and process align with biblical and ecclesiastical foundations. The first of the four philosophical foundations is the principle of accountability. When properly applied, a model assures transparency and accountability between presbyteries and the commissioners they send. It's important to note that commissioners serve both as governors when they're convened as Synod Assembly, and they also serve as liaisons linking back to their presbyteries, as well as with liaisons from other presbyteries. There also needs to be accountability between the Synod Assembly and the governing commission, which serves on its behalf throughout the year in a monitoring function. A large assembly can do certain things better because of its size, and some things are better delegated to a smaller group. This is the best of both worlds, so to speak, but only if there's proper accountability and transparency. Another point of accountability in this governance process is between the Governing Commission and the Synod Executive. This linkage is vital because it's where the larger system that represents the owners hands off authority to one person, who in turn is responsible for all others with whom the executive works, to assure that the vision and interpretation of the Synod's ends are executed properly. The second foundation of the policy governance model is based on the idea of servant leadership. In our Christian context, we can say that Jesus showed his disciples how to take charge of situations on behalf of others, as he did when looking out for the weak and marginalized throughout his ministry. And he also showed the disciples how to be vulnerable and wash the dirty feet of other leaders. All Synod leaders, no matter their role, are called to likewise be prepared to speak and act with courage, while also submitting to the larger good of the whole as led by God's Spirit. The third foundation of this policy-based governance process holds, in dynamic tension, the unique voice and perspective of each leader who's called to serve as commissioner, while at the same time knowing that it is when the group eventually speaks with one voice that it will have integrity and authenticity and power. Said another way, a divided group has little influence, while a group that has encouraged vigorous and constructive debate and is clear about its shared values in the quest for the highest truth can move mountains. The fourth and final foundation is the principle of empowerment. Building alongside the other three foundations of accountability, servant leadership, and clarity of group values, the principle of empowerment allows people to soar as leaders, knowing there is simultaneously safety and freedom, roots and wings, trust and delegation of authority. Presbyteries trust and empower people to serve as stewards, called commissioners. The gathered commissioners trust and empower a smaller group of commissioners to act much like a board on their behalf, and the governing commission in turn trusts and empowers the Synod executive to interpret and carry out the Synod's stated ends using a reasonable interpretation of those ends by constantly considering and testing the best interests of the Synod's beneficiaries. The four foundations lay the groundwork for 10 principles of policy governance. Each of these 10 principles is explained further in a 4-page document you received called Board Governance for the Rest of Us. The first principle simply states that the board represents the interests of its owners, which in this case means the member presbyteries. This stewarding function happens in both the Synod Assembly and the Governing Commission arenas. Second, the board, and again embodied in both the Synod Assembly and in the Governing Commission, must be led in such a way that there is sufficient trust so that all voices in the room can be heard, so that the larger body can discern by God's Spirit in order to reach decisions that can be shared and owned by everyone. When one of the leadership bodies makes its best decision following healthy discernment, each member of that body needs to own and help represent that decision. The third principle states that the board in its two expressions, Synod Assembly in its visioning function and the Governing Commission in its monitoring function, work at the level of policy decisions. Said another way, commissioners attend to what is important and delegate to the Synod executive how things get implemented. Not only do policies need to be clear and direct, but as the fourth principle states, they must be nested like a set of bowls. The most helpful policies will be sufficiently broad to capture appropriate circumstances or conditions. Where more specific policies are needed, these align with and fit within the broader ones so that all policies relating to similar aspects of governance are appropriately nested. A simple example might include a Synod's assembly policy regarding travel reimbursement for commissioners. A policy that details mileage would best be nested in a broader policy regarding meeting expenses, which in turn might be nested in an even larger one addressing an even broader policy. Most of us are familiar with leadership bodies playing the role of receiving proposals in order for others to gain permission before acting. However, the policy governance process is based on a leadership body carefully defining in broad strokes what it wants, and then delegating to others the interpreting and implementing functions. So this fifth principle is not actually all that unusual, though, for this synod, since practically speaking, the Synod of the Trinity has behaved similarly to this for quite a few years. The shift with this model, though, is to a more robust way for commissioners to clarify in advance what the owners expect and define. Now, you might be feeling a little overwhelmed and wondering whether agreeing to be a commissioner really was a good idea. So just take a deep breath or two and let it wash over you when you feel overwhelmed. You'll be fine. And as you read the materials in more detail, this will make more sense. With the implementation of vision of the Synod's ends clearly delegated to the Synod Executive and other staff and committees and groups, commissioners can spend their time sharing, learning, worshiping, and discerning what God is doing among and within presbyteries and their congregations in order to keep providing fresh vision for the Synod as an organizational system. The seventh principle states that a board's best and most appropriate control over what staff can and cannot do as they go about interpreting and implementing vision is by setting clear limits. Everything else is permissible. This is not as crazy as it might first appear. There are significant biblical precedents for this, including God's one limitation given to Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, and God's 10 limitations given to Moses on stone tablets. Policies that set boundaries for the Synod Executive are called, appropriately enough, executive limitations, and they form one of the 4 policy types in the policy manual. The 8th principle may seem more curious in its wording here, but it simply means that there are 3 things that form the board's primary work. And these 3 may not be delegated. 1, its legal and moral linkage to the organization's owners. 2, assurances of executive director performance. And 3, explicit governing policies to accomplish the mission of the organization. For example, the board in its 2 expressions, Synod Assembly and Governing Commission, does delegate to the Synod Executive the interaction with presbyteries when activity pertains to providing benefits for them as beneficiaries. But the board may not delegate owner questions like, who does the board represent? Or how will the board define the job of the chair and how does it delegate to the chair? Or under what circumstances will the board use board committees? These kinds of questions are not the domain of the Synod Executive. Commissioners as individuals and together, and especially the moderator in a chair role, play an important part in making sure the linkage between governance and staff is a trustworthy space with no surprises and with full empowerment. Naturally, this will only work if the Synod Executive assures that staff do not surprise those serving in governing roles. Finally, the 10th principle states that the performance of the Synod Executive must be monitored rigorously, but only using stated criteria. Those of us in congregational leadership can tell stories of pastoral evaluations that have been less than constructive and, shall we say, less than fair. So the policy governance model uses clear policy criteria to assure a healthy and fair evaluation of the Synod executive's performance. And this assures a safe process for the executive, which in turn allows for the executive to take on the responsibility for the outcomes of the benefits to be made available to the beneficiaries, that is, the presbyteries. Okay, another deep breath. That was a lot of material. So let's recap where we are. 4 philosophical foundations that lay groundwork for 10 policy principles. In the unique environment of a synod, what Carver calls a board is actually shared in part by a synod assembly that meets less, but is the locus of authority for the system, and a governing commission to which the assembly delegates to the responsibility of monitoring throughout the year the performance and compliance of the synod executive based on the synod's global end statement. So overstated, but generally accurately, we can say synod assembly does the visioning, governing commission does the monitoring, and synod executive does the implementing. So I'm going to pause for a few seconds while you breathe, because the biggest part of the presentation is behind us now. So why a policy manual? Well, simply put, it provides a systematic approach to guide the overall governance process through all aspects of the organization at all times. And how's it organized? Well, it's simple. It has a preface and 4 sections that we'll glance at very quickly in the next few slides. The main part of the policy manual is divided into 4 sections that match the 4 quadrants of the policy governance process shown here. These 4 sections of the policy are sandwiched between a preface in the front and several appendices at the back. An organization's policies never exist in a vacuum. Thus, the preface places the synod's policies within the context of being a mid-council of PCUSA. Governance process policies describe the policies for the synod assembly generally and the governing commission specifically. And you can read more what's in that section by going to that in your policy manual. The policy quadrant called GCSE is the governing commission and synod executive relationship. And these policies prescribe how the power is shared and how its proper use is monitored, as well as the synod executive's role and authority and accountability. The policy quadrant relating to executive limitations contains policies that address the constraints on authority that the executive has, that establish prudence and ethics boundaries within which all activity and decisions must take place while implementing the synod's ends. And the 4th quadrant is simply called ends, and these are policies that describe the products or impacts or benefits, outcomes, recipients, and their relative worth. That is, it's this 3-part question: what benefit for which beneficiaries and at what cost or priority? So take another deep breath or two. We're almost finished. Let's quickly review. 4 philosophical foundations: accountability, servant leadership, clarity of group values, and empowerment. And with that foundation in alignment with biblical and ecclesiastical commitments, we reviewed 10 principles. I won't recap them all here, but words that emerge from those principles include what you see on the screen here. We also outlined the new policy manual, noting that it had a preface and 4 sections of policy: governance process policies, policies to address the relationship between governing commission and Synod executive, executive limitations policies, and the Synod's ends statement, which is a primary ends statement and a number of slightly more detailed secondary ends statements. And for the sake of review, one more time around the circle that outlines who does what in the policy governance model. Commissioners, as representatives of the presbyteries, the Synod's owners, that is, they gather together to do, among other things, visioning. More detailed aspects of leadership, especially the function of monitoring the Synod executive throughout the year, is delegated to the governing commission. And the Synod executive, working within clearly spelled out executive limitations, as well as empowerment of the governance process, interprets and works with staff and other groups to interpret and implement the Synod's ends for the primary benefit of the presbyteries and their congregations. Now, to better understand your role as a Synod commissioner, please review the first main section of the policy manual that's called GP1, and you'll find full information there on what's expected of a commissioner. Now it's time for you to look more carefully at the materials you've received in preparation for the Synod Assembly and State College. In addition to the circle diagram you've seen now several times, there's a 2-page introduction document that summarizes how the policy manual is laid out, and a 4-page overview of the policy governance process. And please note that the 4th page of that final document has a glossary of terms, so you can better understand what is meant by ends and means and other terms that are used in the model. So thank you so much. I look forward to meeting each of you soon and wish you God's blessings. Goodbye.